Welcome. This lecture is part 2 of the Greeks, and it is on Greek culture. Historians refer to the undeniable sense of Greekness. The Greeks saw themselves as superior. They sought the excellence. The international or the pan-Hellenic athletic contest held at the city of Olympia confirms this sense of Greekness. Indeed, the games were designed for Greeks and Greeks alone. Rather than on team sports, these contests focus on running events. The key event was the foot race, the length of the stadium. In addition to running events, there were discus and javelin throws, wrestling and boxing. There was a unifying spirit of being Greek. However, this did not stop the distrust between the different city-states. They were often at war with each other. Despite this tumultuous military history, Greece continued to flourish intellectually and artistically. They were the lovers of beauty and wisdom. Athenian democracy unleashed great creativity. While building on Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Phoenician traditions, the Greeks branched off to leave a lasting cultural legacy. The Greeks, for all their faults, profoundly shaped the world intellectually and culturally. Philosophically, the Greeks attempted to construct a system based on pursuing the truth at all costs through human reason. Religion was an essential element to Greek life. Polytheism directed the Greeks. There were 12 major deities. Zeus, the sky god, exercised authority over the other gods. Many of us will recognize the names of Poseidon, god of the seas, Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, and Apollo, god of the sun. Although the gods were immortal, they resembled mortals. In fact, the gods were not omnipotent. Quote, they operated within limits set by the fates who personify the inviolable order of the universe. End of quote. Despite the importance of the gods in their lives, the Greeks challenged traditional wisdom that maintained that the world was a product of divine forces and could only be fully understood by the gods. The Greeks wanted to demystify the world. They sought to express and explain life rationally. They embraced rational analysis in their search for an intelligible and orderly world. For example, the Greeks used historical method to find order in the world. They took a different approach than the Hebrews. The Hebrews believed that God acted in human affairs, and for them, the Hebrews, historical events and religious ideas were thoroughly connected. The Greeks did not see history as a record of God's wrath or benevolence, but the actions solely of human beings. British philosopher R.G. Collingwood wrote, and I have a quote here that I will read. The Greeks quite clearly and consciously recognize both that history is or can be a science and that it has to do with human actions. Greek history is not legend. It is research. It is an attempt to get answers to definite questions about matters of which one recognizes oneself as ignorant. It is not theocratic. It is humanistic. The matters inquired into are not of gods, they are of men. Moreover, it is not mystical. The events inquired into are not events in a dateless past as the beginning of things. They are events in a dated past a certain number of years ago. This is not to say that legend, either in the form of theocratic history or in the form of myth, was a thing foreign to the Greek mind. But what is remarkable about the Greeks was not the fact that their historical thought contained a residue of elements which we should call non-historical, but the fact that side by side with these, it contained elements of what we call history, end of quote. And this is from Collingwood's important book, The Idea of History. The Greeks invented history, the study of patterns in history that made the past meaningful. Again, here's the example of this Greek inquiring spirit. Herodotus, who completed his history in approximately 425 BC, is known as the father of history. He argued that Greek victory over the Persians was due to the Greeks' love for freedom. Perhaps you could say that the idea of liberty was in the DNA of Greek citizens. Of the same era, Thucydides sought historical accuracy and sought it to present, and he attempted to present it objectively. And he was born approximately 460 and died 400 BC. So he came a little later than Herodotus. Rather than simply cataloging facts, he, quote, sought those general concepts and principles that the facts illustrated. So Thucydides saw the writing of history as a creation of the rational mind rather than expression of poetic imagination. His history of the Peloponnesian War continues to enlighten readers with an understanding that human behavior repeats itself. In other words, human nature was unchanging. Here he wrote of the conflict between Sparta and Athens. Quote, "Of the events of war, I have not ventured to speak from any chance information, nor according to any notion of my own. I have described nothing but what I either saw myself or learned from others of whom I made the most careful and particular inquiry. The task was a laborious one because eyewitnesses of the same occurrences gave different accounts of them as they remembered or were one side or the other. And very likely the strictly historical character of my narrative may be disappointing to the ear. But if we who desire to have before his eyes a true picture of the events which have happened and of the life events which may be expected to happen hereafter in the order of human things, will pronounce what I have written to be useful, then I shall be satisfied. My history is an everlasting possession, not a prized composition which is heard and forgotten." So this is Thucydides from his work, The Peloponnesian War. And the fact that the book's still in print, you can still buy it, speaks volumes to its importance. And it confirms what he had hoped his work would do, in fact, live on and inform people. But it was a laborious task. It was very difficult to write his history, as it is for good history. Greek culture blossomed when adult males had leisure time to pursue education, athletics, and arts. The Greeks, except Sparta, were socially, politically, and intellectually vibrant, and they welcomed outside ideas. They debated issues related to personal conduct and morality and government. Of course, I'm mostly speaking of the Athenians, that is, the people of Athens. Sparta was much more closed off with a sort of a garrison mentality. Greek plays did much to push the Greek people to think about the importance of democracy. Playwrights used tragedy to shed lights on current affairs. The tragedy represented a cultural statement of Athenian democracy. In the great age of tragedy, you got important people like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These three particularly these three stand out when we speak of Greek tragedy and playwrights. One group interested in understanding human behavior were the Sophists. The Sophists were teachers and professional educators, and their fees were quite expensive. The word sophist literally means wise man. A better translation probably is professor. For them, there was no objective truth, only opinions. They questioned age-old concepts about the gods and morality. They taught their students rhetoric, the craft of how to persuade free men to follow you. I may add that the Sophists were relativists. Again, they did not believe there was any objective truth. Now, to the great Greek philosophers. First, Socrates. Socrates, who lived from 469 to 399 BC. Socrates was born in Athens. For many of those years, Greece was innovative and enterprising. It was an age of creativity, culture, and commerce. Athens was at the epicenter of cultural vibrancy and social mobility. There is the example of a young slave called Passion, who worked hard, running errands, eventually winning his freedom and becoming one of the richest men in Greece. Socrates might have climbed the social ladder, but he chose another path. Socrates' father, a stone carver, saw that his son received a good education of reading, writing, athletics, and music. As a citizen, Socrates did his duty and fought in wars, and he was a good soldier. He appeared indifferent to physical hardship. One friend reported that Socrates, quote, wore thin clothing despite the cold and went barefoot, even in the snow. He demonstrated serenity. If he was angry, he never showed it, quote, except in contrast to most people who raised their voice in anger. He lowered his and spoke quietly, end of quote. He was charming and well-liked by people of all walks of life. In midlife, he witnessed the terrible plague that claimed the lives of many Athenians. His friends were surprised he survived the plague. Biographer Paul Johnson writes, quote, while many fled the city or kept to their houses, Socrates continued his usual practice of walking the streets and talking to all, regardless of possible contagion. So this plague, his approach was really not to change his way of life. He just continued to do what he always did. Socrates' deepest instinct was to interrogate. Living a simple life, and I might note that he had no shoes and he certainly didn't have really much money. He searched for an alternative to relativism. Again, the relativists were the Sophists. Socrates' proposal that the unexamined life is not worth living perfectly represents the Greek quest for truth. Human conduct and morality were to be determined by reason analysis and not by the uncomplicated reliance on the will of the gods. Knowledge, he taught, was synonymous with virtue. Someone who knew the truth would act righteously. Among the magnificent contributions of Socrates to human thought was his determination to subject all issues to reason and his use of dialogue to enable individuals to develop their own opinions rather than relying on authority. He took any one subject and asked someone to define it. What is love? What is piety? What is friendship? His teaching method of questions and answers helped students clarify their thinking and sharpen their reasoning skills. This method is known as the Socratic method. Socrates taught with the expectation that an individual's life and character should be improved. Socrates left no writing. It was his student Plato who wrote of Socrates' work. However, some historians argue that Plato failed to capture the true Socrates. Scholar Gregory Flatos listed important ways the real Socrates was different from Plato's version. First, Socrates was a moral philosopher. 2, Socrates did not believe in forms or recollections of knowledge. 3, he insisted he had no knowledge or wisdom, but he sought it. 4, Socrates took a simple view of the soul as immortal and unified. 5, Socrates claimed no expertise in science. 6, his view of philosophy is populist. And 7, he had no political theory. Historian Paul Johnson sees Socrates as a man, quote, too aware of human weakness and shortcomings to think men could ever substitute themselves for divinity, end of quote. At his most devout, Socrates refers to God rather than to the gods. And on the basis of this, Paul Johnson argues that Socrates was a monotheist. We know this death from Plato's Apology. At age 70, Socrates died as a result of questioning accepted beliefs and making enemies amongst the leaders of Athens. His enemies thought he was a sophist of the worst kind, but clearly they did not understand him. Socrates said, quote, I am wise because I know I am not wise. His trial is a test case for the values of a democratic society, quote, an enduring testament to individual freedom, the right of conscience, and the power of ideas. Declining an opportunity to escape into exile, he took the poison. He was executed by poison. The valor of Socrates in holding fast to his principles before an Athenian court illustrates for all times the need for a personal, steadfast commitment to one's values, even when opposed by powerful and dangerous opponents. But how do we explain the point of view of the Athenian democracy? I mean, it killed Socrates. Quote, Socrates taught an inner voice, the freedom of conscience, the idea that the individual is the ultimate judge of what is right and wrong. That is completely destructive of a democracy based on majority rule. End of quote. Athenian democracy allowed to question every value, but in the end, there was a limit. Cicero summarized Socrates' work. Quote, he was the first to call philosophy down from the sky and establish her in the towns and bring her into homes and force her to investigate the life of men and women, ethical conduct, good and evil. End of quote. A student of Socrates, Plato, born 428, some sources say 427. Plato wrote down what we know of Socrates' work. Plato's main interest was politics, and he wrote the Republic, the description of an ideal society where the virtues of truth, wisdom, and courage were attained. He envisioned a community designed according to rational rules as a response to what he believed were the problems of democratic Athens of his day. Plato moved beyond Socrates' quest for individual perfection based on rational universal principles. Plato believed that the community must also conform to reason and rational rules. His description of an ideal state was more Spartan than Athenian. For him, dangerous and novel ideas were forbidden, poets were banished, and all music was prohibited except the martial patriotic type. In his great dialogue, The Republic, there is ample criticism of Athenian democracy. Plato was aristocratic in birth and temperament, suspicious of liberty played out by the citizens of a democracy. The average citizen was incapable of participating sensibly in public affairs. Distrusting the political judgment of the common people, Plato argued that the best government was one where political leadership rested in the hands of philosophers who were capable of governing according to lasting ideals rather than petty or immediate interests. As explained in The Republic, quote, unless either philosophers become kings in their countries or those are now called kings and rulers come to be sufficiently inspired with a genuine desire for wisdom, unless that is to say political power and philosophy meet together, there can be no rest from troubles for states, nor yet, as I believe, for all mankind. End of quote. Plato believed that philosopher rulers should rule absolutely. However, political leaders needed qualities of virtue and wisdom and could not be motivated by personal ambition, pride, or thought of gain. It is important to note that Plato's doctrine of ideas has always been alluring to people who seek order and unity, stability and virtue in a universe that appears fickle and chaotic. Plato turned inward to the world of forms for intellectual perfection. Less idealistic than Plato, Aristotle based his philosophy on systematic observation of the natural world, careful use of terms of logic. Aristotle was born in 384 and died in 322 BC. One historian wrote that Aristotle, quote, shared with the natural philosophers a desire to understand the physical universe. He shared with Socrates and Plato the conviction that reason was a person's highest faculty and that the polis was the primary formative institution of Greek life, end of quote. While writing on fields as varied as biology, astronomy, psychology, politics, and ethics, Aristotle created a worldview so comprehensive that he became known as the master of those who know. Surveying more than 150 constitutions from which he drew general theories, he concluded that moderation, a balance between democracy and oligarchy, was the key to good government. Aristotle's immense significance in intellectual ideas arises from his having done some of the best thinking up to his time in so many significant intellectual disciplines. In summary, history reveals that the Greeks warred, they massacred, and they enslaved. There were times they were cruel and arrogant, and they could fall short of their ideals. However, they had a major influence on Western thought. And I want to conclude with 4 points on the Greek influence on Western thought. First, there was the emphasis on human reason. Individuals could reason. 2, there was the promotion of political freedom. The idea that individuals were citizens rather than subjects. The state was to be a community of free and equal citizens. Of course, slaves were an exception. From the early civilizations to the modern era, humans enslaved other humans. And the Greeks were no different. Point 3. The Greeks modeled the belief in the idea of ethical freedom. Quote, the heroes of Greek tragedy suffered not because they were puppets manipulated by higher powers, but because they possessed the freedom of decision. And the final point, the Greeks left a legacy of the value of human personality. Individuals had the choice to demonstrate honor and duty or shame and cowardice. As humanists, the Greeks maintained that individuals could control their own lives. Thank you.